introduction. Hi, everyone. As was said, my name is Veronica Scherbauer, and I'm with the Department of Public Safety in our Office of Criminal Justice Services, and we run the Governor's Anti-Trafficking Program and Task Force in our office. I'm going to pull up my presentation here. Bear with me for a second. And are you all seeing my PowerPoint presentation? I know no one's on camera. If I could get thumbs up or perfect. Thank you. I've got my duo screens here, so if I'm not looking at you guys, it's because I'm looking at my presentation here on the other screen. Thank you, everybody. Good to see everyone is awake and responding. I know just from sitting in on the last presentation for a few minutes that this one is going to be a little bit different than maybe what you've discussed today. So I appreciate you coming on board with me and being involved and active in what we're discussing this morning. A little bit of background really quickly as to why we're here doing this presentation. As a part of the Governor's Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force that I'll talk about in a little bit, the Ohio Department of Commerce is one of our participating agencies, and we have been working with them to find ways to incorporate all of the agencies and organizations under their purview in order to spread awareness and information about human trafficking so that you all can help the state in the fight against trafficking and help identify potential victims, as well as protect yourselves and your families and friends from potentially becoming victims of trafficking as well. So we want to thank the Department of Commerce for having us today. And that also kind of explains where this relationship came from and why we are here this morning. So a few notes before we get started on this presentation. First, I want to talk about terminology that will be used. I will use the term victim and survivor pretty interchangeably throughout the conversation. Just know that from a criminal justice perspective, we will typically use the word victim when explaining someone who has experienced trafficking because that's part of our terminology and part of the legal definition of trafficking. But some individuals may not like to be referred to as victims. It can be demeaning or something that's confusing to them. They may prefer to be called survivors. Just know that either way, we want to go with what the individual person wishes and what they prefer to be referred to as. We will also use he, she, they interchangeably. Please know that anyone can be a victim of trafficking. So while I may use the pronoun she more than another pronoun, that does not mean that there are not male victims of trafficking or gender nonconforming victims. Just know that that's the pronoun that I'm using in that moment. And then a note on self-care. This is a really difficult topic to discuss. I want to recognize that I don't know everybody on this call or in this presentation today. Some of you may have experience with some sort of victimization in your past. We've all experienced some sort of trauma in our past, so I want to honor and recognize that as well. But please know that we will be discussing issues such as domestic violence, child abuse, sexual abuse. If this is something that is triggering to you or upsetting, please take a moment to step away from your computer and do what you have to do to take care of yourself. This is a topic that I discuss on a regular basis, so it's really pretty easy for me to discuss, but I do want to recognize that many of you may not talk about these topics very often or may be experiencing your own situation or your own battle with any number of these topics as well. So just do what you have to do to take care of yourself today. And then as far as questions go, I believe we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. If you just want to raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. If it's something that I'll get back to later, I'll let you know that and then I'll come back around to it. I'm also happy to answer questions at the end if we have time. And then my contact information will also be available. So if you think of something later that you want to ask, but you don't want to ask on the Zoom or on the Teams meeting today, you can always email me later on and we can chat that way. So an overview of what we're going to talk about. First, we're going to do a quick Human Trafficking 101. So understanding what the crime of human trafficking is, going over definitions, the scope of the crime, and what the dynamics of the exploitation can look like. Many of you have probably heard of trafficking, either in the news or through media, movies, TV shows. It's something that's pretty much out there now in a lot of different areas. Oh, thank you. Good to see you, Christy. But just please know that we want to make sure we are dispelling rumors and myths today and really talking about what trafficking actually looks like. What trafficking is specifically in Ohio is something that we will discuss as well. Who the traffickers are, what vulnerabilities can look like for potential victims, as well as sample cases that we've seen in Ohio. We'll talk about signs and indicators, so how to identify and how to report, and then a little bit of information, because I am with the state agency, about Ohio's specific response and more information about the governor's task force as well. It's a lot to cover in an hour, so if I talk really fast and you have questions, please stop me. But we're gonna work our way through all of this today. So understanding what human trafficking is. Human trafficking, I have the legal, federal, and state definitions here, but I like to break it down simply as a crime in which people profit from the control and exploitation of others. And it's often referred to as compelled service of others for profit. And in the United States, this compelled service, in order to be identified as trafficking, must include the elements of force, fraud, and coercion, which we will kind of break down and talk about in a little bit here as well. So there's the federal definition, if you're curious, if you want to see what that looks like. We recognize two different types of human trafficking here in the United States in our legal definition. That is sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced, or labor trafficking, which we recognize as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services for the purpose of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. In Ohio, we combine the two into a single definition in our revised code. Essentially, we say that no person should be subjected to involuntary servitude or compelled to engage in sexual activity for hire. So breaking down these definitions and showing you how trafficking occurs. This is the AMP model, or the AMP model. I believe this was developed by Polaris, which is a national nonprofit that serves to fight human trafficking in the United States, but also collects data and information on trafficking and does research in the United States as well. So they break down trafficking by identifying the action taken, so the actions we identified before: recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining. So not simply the act of trafficking. This can include anyone involved, knowingly involved in the process of trafficking an individual through the use of force, fraud, and coercion for the purpose, like we said, of commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, or forced labor or labor trafficking. Now, in the United States, we recognize federally and in state law that individuals under the age of 18 who cannot consent to sexual relationships can also not consent to engaging in commercial sex either. So if you have a minor who is engaging in different types of commercial sexual activity, such as street level prostitution or selling photographs of themselves, we do not have to prove that there was any sort of force, fraud, or coercion behind that trafficking situation in order to get that youth the services that they need. Recognizing again that because that consent element does not exist, because they are minors, we do not have to go through that process legally to recognize them as victims of human trafficking. This is actually a recent change to Ohio's law. Before January of 2021, we did not recognize all minors as a special protected group in our laws. We had it broken down under 16 And then 16 and 17-year-olds were in a different classification. But luckily, that has been a recent change. So now that we match the federal definition as well as every other definition in the United States for every state, recognizing that special group that is protected when it comes to commercial sexual activity. So breaking down the means, obviously force we recognize as physical force, right? So assault, sexual assault, confinement. While force is typically always an element used in a trafficking scenario or situation, it's not typically the element that is used to recruit someone into a trafficking situation. So many of you have probably heard of cases, or maybe you've heard rumors on social media of young people who are kidnapped or confined or held in a basement and trafficked. And while we have seen cases of confinement being used, typically we don't see a lot of forced abductions or kidnappings of individuals to be trafficked. We'll talk later on why that is exactly, but what we typically see more of is the fraud and coercion piece in trapping someone in a trafficking situation. So fraud is defined as an act of deception with criminal intent. We very often see fraud used in trafficking cases where a certain job is promised, a certain amount of pay, a certain living situation is promised, and then once the individual arrives on the scene or engages with that person who has made these promises to them, it turns out that it's not what they expected. We particularly see this in a lot of labor trafficking cases. If you have individuals who are here in the United States on work visas or undocumented in some way, where they are promised a job if they come to the United States, and then they arrive here and it's a completely different situation than what they expected. But we also see this a lot in sex trafficking cases, where you may have an individual who is being trafficked by a loved one or someone who they believe they are in a relationship with. And we'll talk more about what those dynamics mean, but just understand that fraud is a very real part of human trafficking situations. And then coercion is the threat of serious harm against any person or the abuse or threatened abuse of the legal process. Coercion is also very much used to keep individuals in trafficking situations once they are already entrapped. So many times you'll hear people ask the question, why did they ask for help? Why did they call 911? Why did they run away when they realized what was going on? Coercion is a very real tool used by traffickers, either threatening the person that if they try to leave, these things will happen to them, or if they try to leave, their family will be hurt in some way, their reputation will be hurt in some way. And those threats are very real. Sometimes they're acted upon by the trafficker as a way to show what they're capable of doing and as a way of making that threat real. Sometimes they don't need to really act on the threat, right? If we say we're going to hurt your family, oftentimes that is enough of a threat to get someone to agree to engage in these activities as well. Or threatening the abuse of the legal process. So saying, if you are here on a work visa or some other documentation, if you don't do what we want you to do, we will, report you to the authorities and say that you don't have documentation, or we will keep your documentation and you only get access to it if you do what we ask you to do. And that coercion is very real in almost every trafficking case we have seen in Ohio. So I want to play a quick video for you all demonstrating what labor trafficking can look like specifically. We tend to focus on sex trafficking because of a number of different elements. It's a little easier to identify. It's a little less hidden than labor trafficking can be. But to give you a very real example of what this can look like, because it's a very a big idea, right? Labor trafficking, and especially when we use words like debt bondage and slavery, those are not things that we typically find ourselves talking about here in the United States on a day-to-day basis, right? So I just wanted to play this video for you that the Massachusetts Attorney General's office created that we really think does a good job of illustrating what labor trafficking can look like. And I'll try to stop it before it gets to some of the more specific hotline numbers and information for Massachusetts, but just pay attention, close attention to what they're describing in this case example, some of the vulnerabilities that they're going to be talking about, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion once the video is done playing as well. So let me make sure I can share my sound as well. Go to computer sound.
That's Nora. She's your neighbor's housekeeper. She keeps to herself and works early in the morning and late at night. She's just a hard worker, right? Well, maybe not. You might be witnessing something called labor trafficking. Nora may be in a desperate situation and unable to ask for help. Someone like you could be her only hope. So what exactly is labor trafficking? Labor trafficking is a form of human trafficking. Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. It is the illegal exploitation of a person for labor or sex. It occurs in every part of the world, including here in Massachusetts. It happens in cities, suburbs, and rural towns. Human trafficking can happen to anyone. Victims can be any age, race, or gender. They can be U.S. citizens or from other countries. Traffickers tend to exploit vulnerabilities. To lure in their victims, they often prey on challenges like addictions, immigration status, unstable housing, unemployment, language barriers, trauma, or debt. Under Massachusetts law, there are two types of human trafficking: sex trafficking and forced services, also known as labor trafficking. Today, we're discussing labor trafficking. Just like Nora, victims of labor trafficking are often hidden in plain sight. In homes and businesses, you may have seen labor trafficking before, but it didn't register that what you were seeing was actually a crime in action. A better understanding of the signs is needed in order to identify and help. Traffickers often force victims to work for little or no money. They often use scare tactics and threats to isolate their victims and keep them from seeking help.
What? I don't owe you any wages. You still owe me for rent, transportation, food. I'll tell you when you've worked it all off.
What are you gonna do? Run to the police? They will arrest you for not having documents. Then what?
If you leave, I'm going to send those embarrassing photos of you to your family. Think about their reaction. And if you snitch, I'll hurt her.
Don't think I won't. You still owe me.
Often these manipulations of victims are hidden, but there are other signs that may indicate the presence of labor trafficking, including if a person works for little to no pay, is recruited for a job through false promises, has their wages withheld to repay a debt, works long hours or without breaks, works in a building with high security measures like boarded up windows, barbed wire, or security cameras, has no access to their passport or government-issued ID, is given inadequate protective gear or medical attention, is threatened or controlled by their employer. Any one of these could be a sign of labor trafficking and should be reported. Thousands of labor trafficking cases have been reported in the United States, but so many more go unnoticed or unreported every year. That's because labor trafficking is a hidden crime. A crime whose signs may look just like a workplace dispute, a contract disagreement, or a wage complaint. Victims of labor trafficking may be afraid to come forward because their traffickers create a culture of fear, control, and isolation. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't seem right, report what you observe.
National Human Trafficking Hotline. How may I help you?
Your report could help a victim obtain the support and assistance they need to leave their situation and regain their life and freedom. You can help end labor trafficking in the Commonwealth by visiting the Massachusetts Attorney General's website to learn even more about the signs of the crime. Visit and bookmark the Massachusetts Online Labor Trafficking Identification Tool, Result.
think it's getting more into the specifics of Massachusetts reporting, so we don't necessarily need all of that. But I like that video because it highlights the example of a woman who is working in someone's home, right? So she's cleaning up around the home, maybe she's providing some childcare, maybe she's cooking, cleaning, things like that. And that could be really hard to identify as a case of human trafficking, right? If this is simply your neighbor who maybe is very friendly, that you've known for a long time, you know that they have someone who lives with them, or they have a nanny, or they have a person who comes and cleans their home or cooks for them, but you may not necessarily interact with that individual or have any knowledge of what the treatment is like of that person within the home. This is a very real example that we've seen many times in Ohio and across the country as well. And just shows how very difficult it can be to identify a case of labor trafficking. So now we're going to look at the nature and scope of trafficking. And I think that video is a good segue into this conversation because it gives you a more clear picture of what trafficking actually looks like. It's not all, kidnapped kids who are sold like in the movie Taken, right? It's much more insidious than that and something that can be much more difficult to identify. So a quick discussion of some numbers. I do want to give a caveat on any of the data that we discussed today. Because this is a crime that is so hidden and difficult to identify, coming up with real numbers and real estimates can be challenging, but we do want to give you some perspective on what the data can look like. Most of the data we have from here in Ohio comes from service providers who are working one-on-one with survivors and victims of trafficking. A lot of the data also comes from within some of our state systems that serve individuals, like child welfare, the Department of Youth Services, as well as the Department of Rehab and Corrections. So it's all very real data. It's just not the most clear picture based upon our understanding of how hidden the crime of trafficking is. First, looking globally, though, the International Labor Organization produces the estimate that 24.8 million individuals are trafficked globally. And this is the number that is most respected by any of the individuals who work in the trafficking fields. It's estimated that 20 million of those victims are actually victims of labor trafficking, whereas 4.8 million are victims of sex trafficking. And that 4.8 million number, I believe, also includes victims of forced marriages across the globe, because internationally that is seen as a form of human trafficking as well. Many of you may have heard this number that Ohio is the 4th or the 5th or the 6th worst state for human trafficking in the United States. That is a number that we commonly hear quoted in news articles by some of our legislators, people who might be doing trainings on human trafficking. And I want to just talk about what this number actually is and what it really refers to. As we know, we can pretty much make data say whatever you want it to say, right? Data can easily be taken out of context. And in this case, what we really see is that Ohio has the 6th highest number of human trafficking cases reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So when you hear someone say that we're the 5th or the 4th worst, which we were previously in previous years for the hotline calls, what they're referring to is the number of cases that were reported to Polaris and the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So they are not referring to the fact that Ohio is truly the 4th or 5th or 6th worst state for trafficking in the country. They are referring solely to the number of calls that have come into this hotline. So that can be extremely misleading, right? It makes it seem like Ohio is absolutely one of the worst states. And the reality is we don't actually know that. I will say that we have a significant amount of trafficking in Ohio based on the work that we do, but I don't think it's much higher than a lot of other states in the United States that also experience trafficking. As we've said, trafficking can happen to anyone and does happen anywhere and everywhere. That video you just watched talked about Massachusetts, right? in rural parts of the country, in the state, in the cities, in suburbs. So it's not just in one particular place or area. So I challenge you all, if you hear this number, or if you hear someone talking about Ohio being one of the worst states, just refer them back to the National Human Trafficking Hotline report and see what they say to you. Breaking down that number, so there were 310 cases reported to this hotline in 2020. 240 of those cases were sex trafficking, and only 21 were labor trafficking cases. And we'll talk more about the national hotline, but they are a service that's available across the country, and they provide 24/7 access to experts to ask questions about trafficking, but also if you are a victim or survivor and need connection to services, you can call the hotline as well and report your case and ask for assistance. And if you're a service provider, you can also call and ask for connection to services. So that's a really interesting difference there between those two numbers, right? I just want to point that out again so we can make sure we're clear. So the ILO says 20 million victims of labor trafficking, right? Compared to 4.8 million victims of sex trafficking globally. But then here in Ohio, the cases that are actually being reported to the national hotline reflect a very different picture, right? So 240 of the cases reported were sex trafficking, and only 20 were labor trafficking cases here in Ohio. So if 80% of trafficking globally is actually labor trafficking, what are we missing here in Ohio and in the United States if the national hotline only accounts for about 13% of cases being labor trafficking? Just something to consider when you're talking about what human trafficking is and what it looks like, right? We talk a lot about sex trafficking. In Ohio, it seems to be the hot button issue. We especially talk about the ideal victim of sex trafficking, right? A young person, again, who is kidnapped or forced to engage in sexual activity. But the reality is the vast majority of cases that exist that are being identified and not being identified are actually labor trafficking. Globally, here in Ohio, here in the United States, that is really the reality. Just something to keep in mind when thinking about the data and the cases when you hear about them on the news. So where does human trafficking commonly take place? Another report and an investigation done by Polaris revealed the top 25 places where trafficking cases were reported to them across the United States. So in that data that we looked at before, they analyzed where the cases were occurring and created this report on their website. Some of the top places might be surprising to you. I'm not sure, what your belief of what trafficking was before this. Some of the ones I found most interesting, carnivals, state fairs. We see commercial cleaning services, arts and entertainment, hotels and hospitality, construction is a really interesting realization as well, recreational facilities, restaurants and food. And this is commonly reported for both commercial sexual exploitation as well as labor trafficking. So some interesting places that we see this. And I think the thing that, really gets me about this list is that most, if not all of these businesses are legal operations, right? So it would be difficult to identify labor trafficking happening in a completely above the board legitimate business, right? And that's where we find most of the trafficking occurring. And that is where it can be most difficult to identify as well. And a lot of these places are in neighborhoods. So they have neighbors next door, they have other businesses next door, they have regular inspections by different agencies, and it's still something that can be very insidious and difficult to identify. The dynamics of exploitation. So this topic could be its own presentation, and we could take an entire day talking about this, but I really want to give you a little bit of information on what exploitation can look like and why it can be so difficult for victims of trafficking to identify that they are being victimized, and why it can be difficult for them to get help. So we talked a little bit before about the white vans, right, and individuals being kidnapped by traffickers to engage in these activities. The reality, the sad reality, is that most trafficking we see occurs in the context of relationships. So it may involve some sort of grooming process, someone posing as potentially a partner or a significant other, or it could very well involve someone the person's known their whole life, right? A parent or a caregiver, a very close family friend or other family member, or their employer. Traffickers can really be anyone, but what we've seen is that most traffickers will use the trust that is gained in a relationship in order to have that person, that victim of theirs, believe what they're saying, believe the lies that they're telling them, the fraud, and go along with what they've asked them to do until the point that it's too late for them to be able to get out without some sort of repercussion, either for themselves or their family members. So looking specifically at trafficking by family members, this is really absolutely heartbreaking. But we've seen children in Ohio trafficked by parents, by other family members as well, in exchange for not only money, but also maybe a substance or housing, food, things that family or that individual may need to survive. Basic necessities are often exchanged for commercial sex acts or for labor as well. You might hear this referred to as survival sex. We also see cases where potentially the parents or the family members are not the ones actively trafficking the child or the individual in their house, but maybe complicit to the trafficking, right? So they don't know that that's what's going on, but they know that the electric bill is getting paid every month. They're not sure how it's happening, but they know it's happening. So they, again, may not understand the situation, but may be profiting from that exploitation and may be allowing it to happen. Trafficking through peers, we see this, again, it's all about relationships, right? Especially if you have youth who are engaged in human trafficking. Peers are, especially youth, are especially very vulnerable to wanting to be a part of the group, wanting to belong, right? Wanting to do what their friends are doing, wanting to find their space in this world, which we all are, but particularly adolescents and individuals in that developmental phase. So if you have a peer at school, or again, a family member or someone that you know really well who is engaging in this sort of activity and gets you to try it, or seems to be selling it to you in a way that sounds promising or exciting to you, oftentimes traffickers will use those peers to recruit new victims, to again make more profit for them or provide more free or cheap labor for them as well. Trafficking in gangs is something we've just started talking about more in the past couple of years, and can be really difficult for people to accept this concept, right? We automatically assume, especially youth who are involved in gangs, are just bad kids, right? But the more we look at the elements and the way that gangs use things like threats and coercion and violence to coerce individuals into engaging in illegal activity, to benefit the gang leaders specifically, we start to understand that this looks more like trafficking than we thought previously. Many gang-involved youth specifically will engage in activities to benefit the gang leaders, but also to shield the gang leaders from any sort of punishment or recognition for those activities. So they may have youth who sell substances, sell illegal drugs, and then bring the money back to the gang, right? Or engage in violent activity for the benefit of the gang, while also protecting the leadership from being arrested or jailed for those activities. And oftentimes they have to engage in these activities if they want protection in their communities, if they want to be a part of that family. Oftentimes these gangs are seen as families for a lot of these people. Maybe their family literally is in the gang, or maybe that gang is serving the emotional needs of that individual at the time by providing protection and some of their basic necessities that they need. Human trafficking more specifically in Ohio. So just dialing it down a little bit and looking at what this looks like here. I will say that while anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, and there is no exact demographic profile for a victim of human trafficking, there are certain vulnerabilities that particularly make people, again, vulnerable. I wish I had a better word than vulnerable. I feel like we say it so much, but make them particularly vulnerable to a trafficking situation and to this kind of abuse. So foreign nationals, both documented and undocumented. We tend to think of foreign nationals as only undocumented individuals here in the United States, but we have a lot of documented workers who are here on worker visas, guest visas. Here's migrant workers who are, working in our fields and farms, working in our factories, producing the food and the goods that we consume every day here in Ohio. They are here very well legally, very documented and able to be here, but are still very vulnerable because of a language barrier, or because they may not understand their rights here in the United States, or because of economic need. Many of them are here because they need to be making money for their families, right? I mean, who amongst us, I'm sure we all love our jobs very much, but we all do work in order to finance our lives, right? And take care of our families. So economic need is a big driver for these individuals. They may be very far from home and have housing that's only provided to them by the individuals who are trafficking them. I also want to recognize the fact that individuals who are born in the United States and are trafficked can also be very vulnerable, if they have things like unstable housing, unemployment, severe trauma, or any sort of trauma in their background that can make them vulnerable to this sort of victimization as well. And economic need, again, is something that we see time and time again. Another big risk factor for trafficking is being a missing or a runaway youth. So these are just some demographic information, or some information about youth who run away in Ohio every year. I will say that the vast majority, I think it's like 98.9% of individuals who go missing or who run away in Ohio are recovered within 48 hours. Most of these individuals are ages 6 to 12. So we have a few very young individuals. I'm sorry, most of them are 13 to 17. That's in that adolescent age bracket. So we have a few younger individuals, but again, most are 13 to 17 years old. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2021 estimated that 1 out of 6 youth who ran away were likely victims of child sex trafficking. Think about the vulnerabilities that these youth face, right? They're underage already. They're in a very vulnerable spot as far as their development and their understanding of the way that the world works and how they can get their needs met. If they've run away from home, they probably don't have a plan for exactly how they're going to meet their needs. They left maybe because of a situation at home. It may have been a spur of the moment sort of thing, not really well planned out. They may not have any money on them or any food, anywhere to stay. They are especially vulnerable to being approached by someone who may be, initially interested in helping them or taking care of them, but using that tactic of fraud to gain control and trust from that person and eventually traffic them as well. That's why it's particularly important that these individuals are recovered as quickly as they are here in Ohio. But we also see a lot of youth who run away multiple times. either again because they're running away from a bad situation at home, or they are running to someone or something that they prefer over their home life. And we've seen a big shift from law enforcement here in Ohio over the past 10 years in working with these youth to identify, why are you running? Where are you going? Who are you meeting? You know, what's going on? Recognizing that you aren't just running away for no reason. Something's happening here. How can we prevent this from happening in the future and better your situation so that you don't feel the need to run away as well? Our systems and biases also render certain people more vulnerable than others through marginalization. So marginalized groups have less access to resources, protections, and other social currency than some of the more dominant groups here in the United States and in Ohio. Some populations that we can think of are individuals who have disabilities, members of the LGBTQ plus community, migrants and immigrants, as well as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color here in Ohio and in the United States. They have certain vulnerabilities that put them in the outgroup in our society and can make it difficult for them to access the things that they need, to get the help that they need without feeling discriminated against, and can leave them looking for connections and personal connections that can be taken advantage of by traffickers as well. Oops. This is a particular case that occurred in Ohio. I'm going to go through it really quickly, but there is a full documentary that PBS did several years ago on Frontline that you can watch if you're interested to see more about the exact way that this case happened. But there was a group of minors who were here in Ohio undocumented. They were staying with host families that were arranged for them by the US government. And they were trafficked in a chicken processing plant in Marion, Ohio, where they were working in extremely dangerous conditions, debeaking chickens, vaccinating chickens, sorting eggs. They were not being compensated for the work they were doing. Some of these individuals were as young as 14 years old. They weren't attending school. They were living in dilapidated trailer parks with no running water, no heat or electricity in any way. And they were only discovered working in this factory when one of the youth called their uncle who lived in Miami, Florida, and told him what was happening. He didn't say, you know, I'm being trafficked. He just explained their living conditions and the work that they were doing. This uncle contacted the local sheriff's department, and the sheriff's department contacted the FBI. They were able to perform a raid and an investigation where these youth were staying and recover many of them, as well as some adults who were also being trafficked in this farm. And this was like I said, a chicken processing plant just in Marion, Ohio. It was a legal business. They had a third party that performed all of their staffing and hiring for their factories and their farms. I believe that the company who owned this factory has not been prosecuted in any way, but several of the individuals who were hired as the third party to do the hiring for these factories have been charged with trafficking since. Signs and indicators, we've talked about cases, you've seen a lot of these, but it's important to remember that the most important thing that is the difference between, you know, an exploitative situation that is simply just a bad job or a bad situation to be in, and what makes something really trafficking is that threat and that fear, right? So if you leave this job, if you stop engaging in these activities, we will hurt your family, we will hurt you, we will report you to the authorities. All of these bad things will happen to you if you don't do what we say. That's really the biggest difference, right? We oftentimes see employers who hold a debt over the heads of the individuals working for them. So, you know, we transported you to this facility where you're working, right? Or you're living in housing that we own. So you owe us money for those things. And until you pay off that debt, you have to continue working for us. but they charge interest and they charge other fees and other things that they will never be able to actually pay off. But I think that pressure to stay in that job and those threats are really what separates an exploitive situation or a bad job from what human trafficking actually is. Some challenges, again, we talked about these, but the hidden nature of the crime, victims who do not self-identify as victims of trafficking. Traffickers oftentimes will coach their victims not to say anything. They will coach them to be afraid of the police, be afraid of authorities, convince them that no one is interested in helping them. Why would they help you? They use shame oftentimes as a tool to control their victims as well. If you have someone who maybe is engaging in commercial sex work or commercial sexual exploitation, that can be used to threaten someone to stay, right? Who's going to believe you? You've been engaged in prostitution. No law enforcement officer is going to believe that you're being trafficked, right? Or you can't tell your parents or your family that you've been doing this because think of what they're going to say, right? What are they going to think of you when they learn that you've been working in this strip club or that you've been selling these pictures of yourself? And that really keeps people trapped. That fear of being exposed and that shame of potentially the work that they've had to do to survive. So what do you do if you know someone that you think might be trafficked, or you recognize someone who comes into a shop that you think might be in some sort of danger or needs services, right? Obviously, if someone is in immediate danger, please call 911. I highly recommend not intervening yourself. Let's not go rogue. We don't know people's situations. We don't know their lives. We don't want to put people in more danger or ourselves in danger by engaging in a situation, but definitely call 911 if you need immediate help. I also want to give you the human trafficking hotline number that we talked about earlier. Excuse me, that number, again, is staffed 24/7 by experts who are connected to resources, law enforcement, and service providers across the country and here in Ohio. That number is 1-888-373-7888. And you can also visit humantraffickinghotline.org for more information or for reporting cases as well. So looking specifically about Ohio and what we've done to respond to human trafficking. Go through this really quickly. So the governor's anti-human trafficking task force was started in 2012 by the previous administration when the first trafficking law passed in Ohio. This task force was created in order to carry forth the work of the law, of the legislation, and bring together all of the resources and the power behind the state agencies under the governor's purview. So there are 14 state agencies that all work together on the task force, including the Department of Commerce, to identify service gaps and meet the needs of individuals who could potentially be trafficked or have been trafficked in Ohio. And my boss, Maria Bush, who is the statewide anti-human trafficking coordinator, runs the governor's task force and works closely with his office to coordinate that work of the task force as well. We also have many law enforcement task forces here in Ohio that work to not only prosecute cases of trafficking, but also they do a lot of sting operations where they identify potential cases of trafficking. Here in Central Ohio, where I'm located, we have one of the first anti-trafficking task forces in the state. Several of these are funded through federal means. Several of them are funded through the Attorney General's office. So it kind of just depends on where they're located and who they work with specifically. The task force in Toledo is an FBI task force. So it's headed by the FBI, but it also includes members of local law enforcement. All of these task forces, for the most part, are made up of local PD, the sheriff's office in that county, as well as service providers, the prosecutor's office, all working together specifically to collect tips and information on potential cases and investigate those cases. As we mentioned before, As I mentioned before, these cases can be really hard to identify, right? They're occurring in legal businesses oftentimes. They're very hidden. They're occurring to people who may not be reporting that they're being victimized. So they take a lot of time and effort to investigate, which is why we have these specific law enforcement task forces dedicated only to trafficking cases. And then Ohio's anti-human trafficking coalitions exist. These are community level coordinated anti-trafficking efforts. So you can, I'm sorry, the map is kind of small over here on the right, but you can see if your part of the state has an anti-trafficking coalition. I will just say that this map is updated on a regular basis, and I can already see a couple places where there are different coalitions that exist or no longer exist. So if you want to see the current version of this map, you can go to humantrafficking.ohio.gov. That's the task force website, and this map exists there for you to interact with. If you want to get involved with your local anti-trafficking task force, you can click on your county on the map on the website, and it'll bring up all of the contact information for that specific coalition. Most are open to anyone who's interested in participating, and include members from, like we said, law enforcement, victim services, as well as any concerned citizen who wants to participate. A lot of these coalitions provide not only services to survivors when they're identified, but they also provide community education and awareness as well. So these sorts of trainings, like the one I'm doing today for you all, many of our coalitions provide to organizations and individuals living in their communities. And we're in pretty regular communication with all of these coalitions. They actually had their quarterly network call this morning, where all the coalition leaders met and discussed what's going on in their part of the state. We have no control as a state agency over any of these coalitions. We do fund some of them with federal and state dollars, but all of the organization and work occurs at the community and grassroots level, and we are simply a part of it to provide. Did you guys lose me for a second there?
Yes, yes, we did for a minute.
Very weird. Okay, someone's telling me to wrap up then. That's, I don't know. Is that like the virtual cane that comes out and pulls me off stage? Okay.
That wasn't me.
You're fine. So if you want to get involved, again, the website is there at the bottom of the slide. We were wrapping up anyway, so that was pretty good timing. I know that was a lot of information, a lot of really heavy topics to discuss, but I really appreciate you all being here today and listening and being interested in learning about this topic. If you have any questions after today, again, that is my email and my direct phone, and I'm happy to talk about any of these topics more with you, or provide connections or resources if you're interested in learning more or getting involved locally as well. We also have materials, posters, as well as flyers and things like that that we are happy to send to you at no cost. So if you want to make them available either in your place of business, or if you have, you know, a church or somewhere that would like materials talking about what human trafficking is and talking about the national hotline, we're happy to send those out to you as well. But we have about 5 minutes if we do have any questions.
So far, we do not have any questions. Feel free to.
It's a lot all at once. It's a lot to process. I understand.
Yeah. So if anyone has a question, you can type it in the chat room and we'll answer it as fast as we can.
I'm going to go ahead and pull up the task force website and just give you guys a look at what that looks like. So if you are interested in visiting the task force website and learning more, this is what it looks like. Again, there is that map of coalitions. You can see already some of the big differences between the map in my PowerPoint and the map here on the website. Again, you click on the county if you want to learn more. I'm sorry, you click on the name of the coalition below if you want to learn more. So this is the Central Ohio contact information for that coalition. And they're all listed below here as well. And then we also have other resources, videos, training, information on what human trafficking looks like in other parts of the country as well. Looks like we do have a question.
We have a comment from, well, Kevin Howard is asking, is there a difference in human tracking activity between major cities and rural areas?
I mean, there certainly can be a big difference. I think visibility is probably greater in cities than it is in rural areas when it comes to trafficking, because in a city you have people out and about, you have people walking around, people engaging with each other more frequently than you do in a rural area, more likely. In that case that we talked about from Marion, Ohio, that was occurring in a large processing plant that was kind of removed from most other engagement that you would see. So it's certainly different in that rural context than it would be in a city. Is sharing her screen? Can you see anything in the Teams window? You can't see anything?
There's a couple of guests that are having trouble on their end seeing.
Let me try again here.
Okay. All right, that should work at this point.
Can you see I just have my slide up that has my contact information.
Okay. Let me see.
I'm telling you, someone's trying to kick me out of this presentation, you guys. I don't know who it is.
Alan McIntosh just wanted to make a comment. As pawnbrokers, we deal with vulnerable individuals on a daily basis. Thanks for providing a way to discern different types of abuse.
That's great. Yeah, I can only imagine, the kind of people that come into shops if they are looking to sell things to meet basic needs, or if, they may need assistance when they're appearing in front of you, or they look as if they have been experiencing some type of abuse. I would love, again, to send any materials or posters or pamphlets to you all for your stores or your shops if you think that could be helpful, or something that you could refer someone to. I think the national hotline is a great resource for you all as well that you can call if you have questions. I just want to empower you to call that number and to ask for help, right? It can be really difficult when we think we've seen something and we don't know what to do to help people, but really calling that national hotline, you could be saving someone's life, right? Giving them a card or giving them a poster or giving them access to a potential resource could really do a lot to help someone. So I appreciate you all being interested in this, and hope this will give you another tool in your toolbox to help someone if that's something you feel like you could do.
Veronica, thank you so much for an extraordinary presentation, and it's valuable, and thank you.